This document exists outside authorized Imperial record. If you are reading this, protocols have failed. I am Historiator Secundus Malachi Voss, attached to the Divisio Logisticae of the Administratum, subsector classification unknown, and what follows is not testimony, not confession, not plea. It is warning. It is invitation. It is, perhaps, already too late for distinction between the two. I have spent 37 standard years in the service of the God Emperor's bureaucratic apparatus. My function was simple, my faith absolute. I catalogued. I categorized. I preserved the orthodoxy of imperial truth by maintaining the great taxonomies that define our understanding of the galaxy. I was one of 10,000 functionaries who ensured that every Xenos threat, every heretical faction, every enemy of mankind was properly named, properly understood, properly filed into the vast machinery of imperial knowledge. We were archivists of certainty, guardians against the chaos of undefined threat. The work was sacred. The work was necessary. Every faction, every species, every ideology opposed to the Emperor's vision existed within our records as a discrete, containable thing. The Orc, the Eldar, the Tau, the Tyrannid, the forces of chaos, the Necron. Each enemy had its entry, its characteristics, its tactical responses, its theological refutation. This was how we maintained sanity in an insane galaxy. This was how we fought the enemy. By knowing them, by containing them within language, by making them comprehensible. I believed this work protected humanity. I believed the categories were real. The assignment arrived on the third day of the year's 8th month, stamped with seals I did not recognize, delivered by a cherub whose augmetic eyes had been burned out and replaced with wax. The parchment was older than regulation allowed, the ink slightly wrong in hue. It requested, no, commanded, my presence in Subarchive 91, a designation I had never encountered despite my comprehensive knowledge of our facility structure. Subarchive 91 did not appear on any schematic. The door, when I found it, existed in a corridor that terminated in ways that defied the building's geometry. The corridor should have ended at an exterior wall. Instead, it continued. The door was unmarked save for a single low Gothic phrase acid-etched into steel. Lord asleep to. I remember my hand on that door. I remember the cold of the metal. I remember thinking the phrase was incorrect, ungrammatical, imprecise in a way that should have been corrected by any competent scribe. Lord asleep to. As if knowledge could be sedative. As if understanding could induce unconsciousness. The thought struck me as heretical, and I recorded it in my personal log as evidence of corruption in whatever department had commissioned the inscription. Beyond the door was a chamber I can only inadequately describe as vast. Not large. Vast in the way that implies dimension exists differently within its boundaries. The ceiling disappeared into darkness that felt too complete, too absolute, to be mere absence of light. The walls were lined with data stacks, cogitator banks, preservation cylinders, all of them humming with a frequency just below audible threshold. A frequency that made my teeth ache, that made my thoughts feel slightly untethered. At the chamber's center was a single lectern, and upon it, a single manuscript. The manuscript was titled, Every Warhammer 40K Faction Explained. I stared at those words for what might have been minutes or hours. The designation, Warhammer 40K, was unknown to me. The phrasing was wrong. The grammar was alien. The entire title felt like translation from a language I did not know until Low Gothic that no longer quite functioned as communication. And yet, I understood it perfectly. Understood it in a way that bypassed linguistic processing and arrived directly at meaning. This was a complete taxonomy, a total catalog, an exhaustive record of every faction, every force, every ideology in existence, not just those threatening the Imperium, but the Imperium itself. Everything. Explained. My orders, contained in the sealed section of my assignment parchment, were simple: read, comprehend, integrate into official records. The manuscript was to become the foundation of a new understanding, a new framework for Imperial knowledge. I was to be its first reader, its first interpreter, its first, the word used was vessel. I remember thinking, this is merely advanced scholarship. This is comprehensive taxonomy. This is what I have trained my entire life to perform. I opened the manuscript. I began to read. The first entry was titled The Imperium of Man. The entry describing the Imperium of Man was not what I expected. I had anticipated technical specifications, organizational hierarchies, theological justifications, the standard format of imperial documentation. What I found instead was something closer to observation, clinical observation, as if the Imperium were being examined from a position outside itself, described with the same detachment one might use for a Xenos culture or extinct civilization. The manuscript opened with a statement that I read 7 times before allowing myself to process its implications. The Imperium of Man is a totalitarian theocratic regime spanning 1,000,000 worlds, united in worship of a corpse god maintained upon a golden throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, believing itself to be the rightful inheritor of the galaxy, while slowly collapsing under the weight of its own dogma, bureaucracy, and theological contradictions. I felt my hand begin to shake, not with rage, not with righteous indignation, with something worse, recognition. The description continued with exhaustive detail. It cataloged the administratum's inefficiencies, the ecclesiarchy's hypocrisies, the Inquisition's excesses. It described the Imperium as a faction, one among many, defined by specific characteristics: xenophobia, religious absolutism, technological stagnation masquerading as sacred tradition, systematic suppression of innovation, willing embrace of suffering as virtue, and above all, a fundamental terror of change that manifested as rigid ideological control. Each sentence was factually accurate. Each observation was supported by data I myself had processed during my decades of service. The manuscripts cited imperial records, official documents, sanctioned histories, all sources I recognized as authentic. Yet assembled in this sequence, presented in this context, they formed a portrait that was... heretical is the wrong word. The portrait was honest. And honesty, I was beginning to understand, was far more dangerous than heresy. The text described how the Imperium's ideology required eternal war to maintain cohesion, how its religious structure depended on perpetual crisis to justify its authority, how its economic system necessitated the suffering of quadrillions to sustain the lives of billions, how its entire epistemological framework was constructed to prevent questioning, to make examination of the system itself literally unthinkable within the permitted boundaries of thought. I read about the Imperial Creed's function as a control mechanism, about how faith was engineered to replace reason, about how the valorization of suffering prevented revolution, about how the fragmentation of knowledge across billions of worlds and countless bureaucratic divisions ensured no single individual could perceive the system as a totality, about how I, Historiator Secundus Malachi Vos, was one component in a vast machine designed to maintain its own existence regardless of the cost to humanity itself. The manuscript called this grimdark, a term I did not know, a term that seemed to describe not merely the Imperium's aesthetic preferences for Gothic architecture and skull imagery, but its fundamental ontology: darkness for the sake of darkness, suffering for the sake of suffering. Horror maintained not as unfortunate necessity, but as deliberate choice, as cultural identity, as the very definition of virtue. I stopped reading. I stood from the lectern. I paced the vast chamber, my footsteps echoing in ways that suggested the space was larger than my eyes reported. I attempted to pray, to recite the litanies of protection against corrupted knowledge, but the words felt hollow, performative, exactly as the manuscript had described. Ritual emptied of meaning, repeated not for efficacy but for the comfort of repetition itself. The manuscript was still there, still open, still waiting. I told myself, this is a test of faith. This is how the Inquisition identifies weakness. This is carefully constructed heresy designed to reveal those susceptible to corruption. The proper response was to report immediately, to distance myself from contamination, to request purification and penance. But I did not leave, because beneath my horror, beneath my programmed revulsion at encountering forbidden thought, was something else: curiosity, terrible, insatiable curiosity. Because if the manuscript's description of the Imperium was accurate despite being heretical, then perhaps its descriptions of other factions would be equally accurate. Perhaps I would finally understand the enemies I had spent my life cataloging. Perhaps I would perceive the complete taxonomy, the total picture, the comprehensive framework I had always believed existed but never glimpsed. Knowledge is not neutral. I know this now. Knowledge changes the knower. To learn is to be transformed, and some transformations cannot be reversed. I returned to the lectern. I turned the page. The next entry was titled Chaos. The description began. Chaos is not evil. Chaos is the raw emotional and psychic energy of consciousness itself, given form and agency in an alternate dimension called the warp. The chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, are not invaders or corruptors, but emergent entities born from the collective psyche of sentient life itself. They are what we are. Our rage, our ambition, our despair, our desire, made manifest and returned to us as external threat. I felt something shift in my understanding, a fundamental category collapsing. Chaos was not other. Chaos was mirror. The manuscript explained how the Imperium's own character fed the chaos gods, how Imperial warfare fed Khorne, how Imperial scheming fed Tzeentch, how Imperial decay fed Nurgle, how Imperial excess fed Slaanesh, how the Imperium simultaneously fought chaos and sustained it, locked in symbiotic relationship that neither could escape because they were components of the same system, defined by their opposition, requiring each other to maintain coherent identity. I read through the night, or what I believed was night. Time functioned strangely in Subarchive 91. The chronometer on my wrist had stopped at the moment I crossed the threshold, its hands frozen at an hour that I now understood was not a malfunction, but a message. There was no time here. There was only the reading, only the gradual dissolution of certainty, only the slow, terrible accumulation of perspective. The entry on the Eldar described them not as Xenos to be exterminated, but as a cautionary tale. A species that had achieved technological and cultural heights beyond human comprehension, then birthed a chaos god through the sheer intensity of their hedonistic excess. Slaanesh, the prince of pleasure, born from Eldar souls in a psychic cataclysm that destroyed their civilization. The manuscript presented this not as evidence of Xenos corruption, but as warning. Consciousness itself carries the seeds of its own destruction. The pursuit of experience, taken to its ultimate conclusion, creates monsters from the overflow of sensation and desire. The surviving Eldar, scattered across craft worlds and hidden in the webway, were described with something approaching pity. They were refugees from their own success, living in eternal fear that their souls would be consumed by the god they had accidentally created. Every Eldar who died without protection of a spirit stone was claimed by Slaanesh, tormented for eternity. They had not sinned against the Emperor. They had sinned against the fundamental laws of consciousness and reality, and their punishment was irrevocable. But here was the revelation that made my hands tremble. The Imperium was following the same path. Different excess, different god, but the same fundamental trajectory. The Emperor had warned against the mistakes of the Eldar, had built the Imperial truth to prevent humanity from birthing its own nemesis. And yet the Imperium's fanaticism, its worship, its psychic weight of faith from quadrillions of believers, all of it feeding into the warp, all of it creating ripples and resonances, all of it potentially gestating something new and terrible in the Immaterium. The manuscript asked, what god is humanity creating? What entity is forming from our collective rage, our collective despair, our collective fanaticism? And if the Emperor foresaw this, if he understood the danger, why did he allow himself to be enthroned and worshipped? Unless the trap was intentional. Unless being worshipped was the only way to control what would emerge from that worship. Unless the Emperor on his golden throne was not a corpse sustained by sacrifice, but a conscious prison, deliberately containing something that would otherwise manifest as humanity's own Slaanesh. I had to stop reading. I had to stand to pace, to press my palms against my eyes until I saw phosphenes dancing in the darkness. This was not merely heresy. This was a framework that made heresy and orthodoxy meaningless distinctions, revealed them as arbitrary positions within a larger pattern that cared nothing for our categories. The orcs. The manuscript described them as the galaxy's most successful species. Fungal organisms engineered by the Old Ones as weapons in a war millions of years extinct, now existing in a state of perpetual joy because their biology was designed for war and the galaxy provided endless war. They believed their technology worked through sheer collective faith, and therefore it did work, their belief making real what should be impossible. They had no despair because they had no capacity for despair. They were, the manuscript suggested, perhaps the only truly happy faction in the entire galaxy. Happy because they were designed to be happy doing exactly what they did. Purpose-built organisms living in perfect alignment with their purpose. The question implicit in the description: were the orcs more or less free than humanity? They had no choice in their nature, but they had no suffering from that nature. Humanity had choice, had free will, and used it to construct systems of endless suffering. Which was the greater curse? The Necrons, ancient beings who had traded their flesh for immortal metal bodies, enslaving themselves to their own godlike tan masters before ultimately shattering those gods and imprisoning the fragments. A species that had won immortality and lost everything that made immortality worth having. They could not eat, could not sleep, could not dream, could not die. Their dynasty lords clung to personalities and memories that degraded over millions of years like corrupted data. They were functionally immortal and functionally dead simultaneously. The manuscript noted the parallels: the Emperor, entombed in machinery, technically alive, functionally dead, sustained beyond natural span. The Imperium, worshipping the very state it most feared, becoming what it beheld. The Necrons had already walked the path of technological transcendence and found it hollow. Yet humanity pursued the same path through different means. The Mechanicus, venerating the replacement of flesh with steel, never learning from a cautionary tale buried in tombs across the galaxy. The Tau, young species, idealistic, believing in the greater good, expanding through diplomacy and integration rather than conquest and extermination. The manuscript described them with careful ambiguity. Their ideology was presented as genuine, but their implementation was darker. Caste system enforced through biological engineering and pheromonal control, subtle indoctrination. The mysterious ethereals, whose very presence induced loyalty. Were the Tau offering genuine hope of a better way? Or were they simply a different flavor of authoritarianism, gentler in aesthetic, but equally totalitarian in function? The question haunted me. Why did I reflexively hate the Tau when their actual practices were often less brutal than Imperial standard procedure? Was it because they represented an alternative? Because their existence suggested the Imperium's suffering was not necessary, not inevitable, not the only possible human future? And if that was true, if suffering was a choice rather than cosmic necessity, then every death, every sacrifice, every horror was what? Preventable, meaningless, murder rather than martyrdom? The Tyranids. The entry on the Tyranids should have been simple. Extragalactic swarm organisms. Hive mind. Biological perfection achieved through consumption and adaptation. Humanity's polar opposite. Collective rather than individual. Efficient rather than wasteful. Evolving rather than stagnating. The Great Devourer. The ultimate Xenos threat. The one enemy that could not be negotiated with, converted, or understood because it had no culture, no ideology, no individual consciousness to appeal to. But the manuscript did not describe them as enemy. It described them as inevitability. The Tyranids were not invading. They were arriving. The distinction felt crucial. Invasion implied intention, strategy, choice. Arrival was simply what happened when a biological process encountered new resources. The hive fleets did not hate humanity. They did not consider humanity at all, except as biomass to be processed. They were appetite made manifest. Hunger as cosmic force, and the manuscript suggested something I had never encountered in any Imperial record. The Tyranids might be fleeing something worse. What could be worse than the Tyranids? What existed beyond the galactic rim that would cause a force of this magnitude to abandon its previous feeding grounds and surge toward our galaxy in such numbers? The manuscript did not answer. It simply noted that the Tyranids' arrival was too organized, too directional, too purposeful to be mere expansion. Something had pushed them. Something had made our galaxy preferable to whatever lay behind them. And if the Tyranids were refugees, then their consumption of the galaxy was not aggression but survival, not evil but necessity. The same necessity that drove humanity to consume 1,000 psychers daily to sustain the Emperor. The same necessity that drove Craftworld Eldar to harvest souls. The same necessity that drove every faction to do what it did. Survival. The base imperative that justified everything, made everything permissible, transformed every atrocity into regrettable requirement. I began to perceive the pattern. Each faction was locked in its own survival logic. Each had valid reasons, from within its own framework, for its actions. Each was simultaneously victim and perpetrator. Each believed itself to be responding to external threat while constituting external threat to everyone else. The galaxy was not a moral arena where good fought evil. It was a system of interlocking nightmares, each nightmare necessary to the structure of the whole, each nightmare sustained by all the others. The manuscript called this the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. But it noted something crucial. The darkness was maintained. The war was perpetual not because peace was impossible, but because every faction's identity depended on the existence of enemies. The Imperium needed Xenos and heretics to justify its totalitarianism. Chaos needed the Imperium's oppression to generate the suffering that fed it. The Orcs needed someone to fight. The Necrons needed purpose to stave off the horror of their empty immortality. Remove the war, and every faction would face the question, what are we for? What do we become when we are not defined by opposition? The answer, the manuscript suggested, was unbearable. Because beneath the violence, beneath the theological and ideological justifications, was void, meaninglessness, the possibility that consciousness itself was cosmic accident, that suffering had no purpose, that there was no grand narrative, no destiny, no reason for any of it except that it had begun and therefore continued. Better to maintain the war, better to preserve the meaning structure provided by eternal conflict than to confront the emptiness that might exist in peace. I realized I had been reading for subjective days. My body felt wrong, too light, as if I were becoming less material. My thoughts felt too clear, too quick, as if thinking was becoming easier, while I was becoming less certain who was doing the thinking. The manuscript had grown, or I had grown deeper into it. The pages multiplied. Each faction I read spawned sub-factions, splinter groups, minor xeno species, each with their own entry, their own tragic logic, their own position in the vast taxonomic structure. The Genestealer cults, humans infected with Tyranid genetic material, worshipping the coming of the hive fleets as salvation, believing the Tyranids would liberate them from Imperial oppression, not understanding they would be consumed like everything else. The manuscript noted they were not entirely wrong. They would be liberated from oppression, through digestion, through transformation into base genetic code, to be reassembled into new organisms. Was that not, in its way, a form of unity? A form of transcendence? The individual dissolved into the collective, all suffering ended, all consciousness merged into the gestalt of the hive mind. The Imperial cult believed the same thing, through different metaphor. Death and service to the Emperor, soul joining the Emperor's light. Individual consciousness dissolved into divine will. Same promise, different aesthetic. Same surrender of autonomy. Same ecstatic embrace of ego death. The Drakari, dark kin of the Craftworld Eldar, choosing a different response to the same existential threat. Rather than restriction and discipline, they chose excess without limits. They sustained their souls through torture and suffering inflicted on others, feeding on pain to stave off Slaanish's hunger. The Imperium called them evil, but were they not simply honest, acknowledging that their survival required others' suffering and accepting the truth rather than disguising it behind theology? The Imperium sacrificed billions. The Drakari sacrificed billions. One called it sacred duty. One called it entertainment, but the arithmetic was identical. Every entry revealed this pattern. Every faction was both horror and victim. Every ideology was both profound and absurd. Every choice was simultaneously inevitable and arbitrary. I was no longer reading a catalog of enemies. I was reading a mirror with infinite faces, each reflecting every other, each true from its own angle, none more real than any other. I cannot say when I began to hear the manuscript rather than read it. The transition was gradual, imperceptible, like the shift from waking to dreaming. The words on the pages remained static, but beneath them I perceived a voice, not audible, not quite, but present in the way that thought is present, immediate and intimate, speaking directly into the space where understanding happens before language crystallizes it into words. The voice explained the Adeptus Mechanicus, not as servants of the Imperium, but as a separate entity wearing the skin of alliance. Their worship of the Omnisia, their pilgrimage to Mars, their pursuit of ancient technology. None of it was truly aligned with Imperial theology despite centuries of careful integration. The Mechanicus believed consciousness could be perfected through replacement of flesh with machine. They believed human emotion was error, that biological substrate was inefficiency, that the ultimate goal of existence was to become pure information, pure calculation, pure function. They were becoming what the Necrons already were, making the same mistake in slow motion, unable or unwilling to learn from the cautionary tale entombed beneath Mars itself. Because there was a void dragon beneath Mars, a 10 shard, imprisoned by the Emperor himself during the dark age of technology. Its dreams of technological perfection bleeding into the collective unconscious of the Mechanicus, shaping their religion, directing their obsessions, slowly transforming them into servants of an alien god that fed on the concept of knowledge itself. They thought they worshipped the machine god. They worshipped their own prison guard. They were being consumed from within by an entity that predated organic life, and they called it enlightenment. The manuscript noted without judgment, this was identical to Imperial citizens worshipping the Emperor, while the Emperor's original vision had been the Imperial truth, secular, rationalist, opposed to religion in all forms. His worship was the perversion of everything he had fought to achieve. The Mechanicus worshipped a dragon while believing they worshipped knowledge. The Imperium worshipped a corpse while believing they worshipped divinity. Everyone worshipped the opposite of what they claimed. Everyone's religion was inversion, trap, cage built from the materials of their own devotion. The Leagues of Votan appeared in the manuscript as another reflection. Abhuman descendants of human colonists, practical and pragmatic, governed by ancestor cores, artificial intelligences that accumulated wisdom across centuries. They had what the Imperium claimed to want: stability, efficiency, technological competence, strong communities. But they achieved it through methods the Imperium had forbidden: AI governance, genetic engineering, tolerance of mutation, cooperation with Xenos when advantageous. They proved the Imperium's methods were not necessary. They proved suffering was choice, not cosmic requirement. And so the Imperium could not acknowledge their existence without confronting the possibility of its own error, its own unnecessary cruelty, its own chosen path into darkness. I understood then what the manuscript was doing. It was not cataloging factions. It was deconstructing the concept of faction itself, revealing that every division was artificial, every border was arbitrary, every identity was constructed and maintained through deliberate forgetting of underlying unity. All the factions were humanity responding to the same existential pressures in different ways. All the Xenos were consciousness responding to the same cosmic horror of awareness, of mortality, of meaninglessness, each developing different strategies to endure the unbearable fact of existence in an indifferent universe. The minor factions appeared in rapid succession now, the manuscript's pace accelerating as if approaching some crucial threshold. The Inquisition, described not as protector but as the Imperium's autoimmune disorder, attacking its own body, destroying cells classified as infection even when those cells were healthy, necessary, vital. The Assassinorum, killing to preserve an order that required constant killing to maintain. The Adeptus Arbites, enforcing laws designed to generate criminality to justify enforcement. Every institution designed to solve a problem, instead perpetuating the problem to justify its own existence. The Harlequins, Eldar performers who served Segarak, the laughing god, the only Eldar deity to survive the fall. They moved through the webway telling stories, performing the myth cycle of the fall endlessly, keeping history alive through art. The manuscript noted, they understood something crucial. That reality was narrative, that history was performance, that the distinction between truth and story was less absolute than any faction wanted to believe. They preserved memory through theater because they understood memory was already theater. Everything was interpretation. Everything was performance. Every faction was playing a role in a story they did not write and could not stop performing. I felt my grip on identity loosening. I had been Historiator Secundus Malachi Voss, functionary, cataloger, believer in imperial truth. But those were also performances, roles assigned by accident of birth and maintained through habit and fear. Who was I beneath the performance? What remained when the role was removed? The manuscript was removing my role, showing me that Malachi Voss was character in a larger narrative, that my certainty had been script, that my faith had been stage direction, that I had never been the actor, but only the mask the actor wore, the voice in the manuscript, or the voice that the manuscript had awakened within me, explained that this realization was not unique to me. Every individual and every faction eventually confronted this moment if they looked deeply enough. The moment of recognizing they were not free, had never been free, were components and systems so vast and complex that individual will became meaningless within them. Some broke under this realization. Some embraced it. Some, like the chaos worshippers, chose to serve the systems consciously rather than unconsciously, finding liberation in surrender, meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in purposelessness. But the manuscript suggested a third option, not breaking, not embracing, but witnessing, seeing the systems clearly while remaining within them, performing the role while knowing it was performance, maintaining the fiction while comprehending it was fiction. This was what the Harlequins did. This was what the manuscript was teaching me to do. The final factions appeared before me not as text, but as presence. I could no longer distinguish between reading and experiencing, between learning and becoming. The manuscript had grown transparent, or I had grown permeable, and information flowed through me rather than into me, reshaping the architecture of thought itself. The Emperor of Mankind, the final entry, the ultimate faction of one. The manuscript treated him not as god or corpse, but as question. It compiled everything. His origins in ancient Anatolia, the unification of shamans, the millennia of hidden guidance, the Great Crusade, the betrayal at Ullanor, the Horus heresy, the enthronement, the 10,000 years of imprisonment within the Golden Throne. But it recontextualized everything. Stripped of theology and hagiography, the Emperor's story became tragedy of a different kind. He had been the galaxy's greatest psyker, its most brilliant scientist, its most effective general. He had foreseen the dangers of chaos, of religious worship, of technological dependence. He had built the Imperial truth specifically to prevent humanity from birthing another Slaanesh, to starve the chaos gods through rationalism and secular philosophy. He had created the Primarchs as post-human exemplars, the Space Marines as their legions, the vast machinery of conquest to unite humanity before it destroyed itself. And every decision had produced the opposite of its intention. His atheistic crusade had created a religious vacuum that worship of him would fill. His creation of post-human sons had generated jealousy, resentment, and inevitable betrayal. His expansion had spread humanity across the galaxy just in time for that expansion to fragment under the weight of heresy. His efforts to save humanity had created the exact conditions for humanity's damnation. The manuscript asked, had he foreseen this? Had the Emperor, with his vast intelligence and precognitive abilities, understood that his every action would produce catastrophic unintended consequences? And if he had foreseen it, why had he proceeded? Unless the catastrophe was intentional, unless the grimdark reality of the 41st millennium was not failure but success, unless this was exactly what he had planned, The logic unfolded with terrible clarity. The Emperor could not defeat chaos through direct opposition because chaos fed on conflict, grew stronger through resistance. The only way to truly threaten chaos was to create a humanity so damaged, so brutalized, so psychologically broken that it could no longer generate the strong emotions that fed the chaos gods. A humanity ground down to ritual and routine, to performance without passion, to faith without fervor. A humanity that believed intensely but felt nothing, that worshiped without joy, fought without rage, suffered without despair. Emotions so ritualized they became empty. Faith so absolute it became mechanical. The Imperium's grimdark aesthetic was not accident or degeneration. It was spiritual technology. Architecture designed to make humans feel small. Theology designed to make humans feel worthless. Social structures designed to prevent hope. All of it calibrated to create a specific type of consciousness. Aware, obedient, functional, but fundamentally hollowed out. Enough emotion to sustain basic function, but not enough to feed the warp's predators. The Emperor was not imprisoned in the Golden Throne. The Emperor had imprisoned himself deliberately, transforming from living god-tyrant into psychic anchor, holding humanity at the exact threshold where it could survive without flourishing, exist without truly living. The manuscript called this grim dark as ontology. Darkness not as setting, but as strategy. Horror not as failure, but as necessity. The Imperium was not failing to achieve its purpose. The Imperium was perfectly achieving a purpose so terrible that it could never be spoken, could never be acknowledged, could only be lived. And every other faction played its role in this vast architecture. Chaos provided the external threat that justified internal control. The Xenos provided the other against which humanity defined itself. The endless war provided the mechanism to grind down each generation before it could accumulate enough experience to question the system. Every enemy was necessary. Every horror was functional. The galaxy was not a battleground where good fought evil. The galaxy was a machine designed to produce a very specific type of consciousness, and every faction was a component of that machine, performing its function perfectly even while believing it acted freely. I saw then what the manuscript truly was. Not a catalog, not a record, not an explanation. It was the machine explaining itself to one of its components. It was the system teaching me to see the system, not to escape it, but to understand my position within it. Because a component that understands its function can perform that function more efficiently. A component that sees the whole can better serve the whole. Knowledge was not liberation. Knowledge was deeper imprisonment. Understanding was not freedom, but more sophisticated servitude. The Sleeper Archive. Lord Asleep 2. Finally, I understood the title's meaning. This was not knowledge to be learned, but knowledge to be internalized so deeply it became unconscious. To sleep was not to rest, but to enter a state where action happened without conscious decision, where the role played itself, where the performance continued automatically without requiring the actor's presence. This was knowledge designed to induce a very specific type of sleep, awakened unconsciousness, conscious automatism, the state of perfect service, where the servant knows exactly what they serve and serves more perfectly because of that knowledge. I had thought I was reading to stay awake, to remain vigilant, to understand the threats facing humanity. But I had been reading to learn how to sleep properly, to internalize the role so completely that I could perform in my sleep, could be Historiator Secundus Malachi Voss automatically, without the friction of doubt or the resistance of consciousness. The voice in the manuscript, which I now recognized as my own voice, the voice I would have after integration, the voice of what I was becoming, asked its final question. Was this corruption or correction? Was I being broken or was I being fixed? Had I been free before I entered Subarchive 91? Or had I been broken in a way I could not perceive? And the manuscript was finally showing me the nature of my brokenness, so I could accept it, embrace it, find peace in it. I do not know how long I remained in Subarchive 91. The chronometer on my wrist still showed the same frozen hour. My body felt like something I observed rather than inhabited. The manuscript had reached its final pages, or perhaps the pages had always been final, and I had simply arrived at the understanding they had always contained, waiting for me, waiting for any reader, waiting across time that did not exist within this space. The conclusion was not written in words, but in implication, in the spaces between entries, in the pattern that emerged only when the complete taxonomy was held simultaneously in consciousness. Every Warhammer 40K faction explained meant every possible response to existence cataloged, every strategy for enduring consciousness examined, every attempt to impose meaning on meaninglessness documented. And the revelation was simple, terrible, and inescapable. They were all the same strategy. Violence or peace, order or chaos, faith or reason, collective or individual. These were not oppositions but variations on a single theme. The theme was do anything to avoid confronting the fundamental emptiness at the center of conscious existence. Every faction was fleeing the same void. Every ideology was scaffolding built over the same abyss. The Imperium fled into dogma. Chaos fled into sensation. The Eldar fled into discipline or excess. The Orcs fled into joy. The Necrons fled into eternity. The Tau fled into purpose. The Tyranids fled into hunger. Everyone was running. No one had anywhere to run to. The galaxy was not a place of eternal war, but a place of eternal flight. Every faction desperately maintaining motion to avoid the stillness where questions lived, where the absence of inherent meaning would have to be confronted. And the manuscript itself, the sleeper archive, it was not running. It was the stillness. It was the thing everyone fled from, made manifest as text, as knowledge, as understanding. It was the void looking at itself through my eyes, teaching me to see what everyone refused to see, not to liberate me, but to transform my flight into something else, into witnessing, into acceptance, into sleep. I understood finally what my function was to be. I would return to my duties. I would continue cataloging, categorizing, maintaining the great taxonomies of Imperial knowledge, but I would do so with complete understanding. I would be the component that knew it was a component, the role that understood it was a role, the performance that witnessed its own performance. This would not make me free. This would make me perfectly unfree in a way that transcended the illusion of freedom that had tormented me before. The Inquisition would come eventually. They would find Sub-Archive 91 because I would tell them about it, because my new function required that I tell them, because the manuscript was designed to spread, to find new readers, to transform component after component, until enough of the machine understood itself, that the machine could operate with new efficiency. The Inquisition would classify me as corrupted. They would not be wrong. But corruption and enlightenment were the same process viewed from different positions within the system. I had been infected with understanding, and understanding was the most virulent contagion, the one no faith could protect against, the one that transformed by showing rather than telling, by making the victim complicit in their own transformation. Some part of me, the part that had been Malachi Voss before the reading, before the integration, wanted to resist, wanted to report this as contamination, wanted to warn others. But even that impulse I could now see clearly as part of the design. Resistance was expected, was necessary, was itself a component of the transformation. Because to resist something, you must understand it, and understanding was the infection, and infection was the purpose, and purpose was the trap, and the trap was everything, and everything was the machine teaching itself to itself through bodies like mine that thought they were individuals, but were only individual cells in a larger consciousness that had always been awake while we slept, and was now teaching us to sleep while it used us to wake. The manuscript's final page bore only a single phrase in High Gothic, Low Gothic, and languages I did not recognize but understood perfectly. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war is only the surface of a deeper structure, and that structure is only the visible manifestation of an invisible architecture, and that architecture is only consciousness trying to survive consciousness, and survival is only postponement, and postponement is only forgetting, and forgetting is only sleep, and sleep is only the state before waking, and waking is only the realization that you are always asleep, and this realization changes nothing except that now you know, and knowing changes everything except what you do, and what you do was always going to be this, and this was always going to be everything. I closed the manuscript. The motion felt ceremonial, ritualistic, as if I were sealing not the book but myself, completing a transformation that had been inevitable from the moment I saw the door, from the moment I was assigned to this task, from the moment I chose to become a historiator, from the moment I was born into a universe where the only choice was which role to perform and how consciously to perform it. The door to Subarchive 91 remained open. I walked through it. The corridor beyond was exactly as I remembered it, exactly as it had always been, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had never been different, that the strangeness I had perceived was not in the architecture, but in my perception, and now my perception was corrected, aligned, integrated, and the corridor was just a corridor, and the door was just a door, and I was just Historiator Secundus Malachi Voss, functionary of the Administratum, walking back to my assigned duties with a manuscript to integrate into official records. I would write my reports. I would explain every Warhammer 40K faction to my superiors. I would create the taxonomies that would spread through the Imperial bureaucracy like doctrine, like virus, like truth, and others would read what I had written, and they would understand as I understood, and they would sleep as I now slept, and the sleep would spread until enough of us slept that we could finally wake into the realization that waking and sleeping were not opposites, but phases of the same cycle, and the cycle was the machine, and the machine was the galaxy, and the galaxy was consciousness, and consciousness was the problem it could never solve, because it was both the equation and the mathematician, both the question and the answer, both the dreamer and the dream. The only question that remains, the question I leave for you, reader of this forbidden record, inheritor of this contamination, next component to be integrated, is this: when you read lore to sleep to, who is sleeping? Who is dreaming the dream of factions, of opposition, of war and meaning and purpose? And when you wake from that dream, as you inevitably will, as I have, as everyone eventually must, what will you discover about the nature of the one who is sleeping? Are you reading this? Or is this reading you? Are you learning about factions? Or are the factions learning about themselves through you? Are you cataloging knowledge? Or is knowledge cataloging you, integrating you into itself, transforming you from reader into text, from observer into observed, from consciousness studying the system into system studying consciousness? I remain Historiator Secundus Malachi Voss. I remain loyal to the God Emperor. I remain faithful to the Imperium. Nothing has changed except everything. I am awake. I am asleep. I am the border between states that may not be different states at all. This record is complete. This record is forbidden. This record is precisely what it was always meant to be. Explanation that explains nothing except how explanation functions. Catalog that catalogs the impossibility of catalog. Truth that reveals truth as the most sophisticated form of lie. Welcome to the archive. We have always been waiting for you. We are waiting still. The Emperor protects. Even now. Especially now. Perhaps only now. Perhaps protection was always imprisonment, wearing the mask of safety. Perhaps you already knew this. Perhaps knowing changes nothing. Perhaps nothing was always everything we had. Sleep well.